I grew up in the 1950s in a staunchly Democratic family. Everyone told me that Democrats were the party that represented workers and Republicans were the party of big business. My political sympathies were for people who brought home a paycheck, as I always expected I would. In 1960, I was an obsessive Kennedy supporter and proudly Democratic during the days of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society bills. But that enthusiasm for the Democratic Party was smashed with our takeover of the war in Vietnam. By 1967, I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, where opposition to the war was intense and brutally suppressed under Governor Ronald Reagan. The Vietnam War was, for many people of my age in colleges across the country, a radicalizing experience. Many of us became immersed not just in the battlefield news from Asia, but also in the overriding question: how could the United States have ever gotten into this war? In search of an answer, I turned to the Marxist critique of capitalism. Some of Marx's writings I thought were brilliant, particularly historical materialism, the idea that the evolution of society is the product of the conflict within its relations of production. I never bought into some other ideas like dialectical materialism. In Berkeley, most of the Marxists who influenced me were Maoists. They were friends, highly intelligent and well-read, but I always had an underlying aversion to any of the ideological descendants of the Soviet Revolution. For example, I could never understand why any American would have the slightest interest in the Stalin question of whether he should be regarded as a communist hero or a murderous despot. But fundamentally, I was on their side against the New Left, the principal alternative to Marxism in Berkeley of the 1960s. The New Left was also anti-capitalist, but maintained that workers in America had no revolutionary potential. I believed then, as I do today, that capitalism can only be overthrown through class struggle. During the 1960s, I became disillusioned with the Democratic Party. I realized that it could never be the party of the working class because it was eternally committed to capitalism. After the 1960s, my political views were consistent for a long time. My next development came in the 1980s in response to the political ascent of the religious right. They had me perplexed. How, I wondered, was it possible for these people to be wrong on absolutely every issue? I still was not yet a self-aware atheist, but became a firm supporter of the separation of religion and government. My own ethical framework is utilitarianism, based on the principle that our obligation is to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. I believe that the only objective basis for ethics lies in the actual consequences of our actions, and that utilitarianism is the altruistic, egalitarian expression of consequentialism. When I moved to Minnesota in 1994, I soon discovered the Deleonist monthly newspaper, The New Unionist. I was impressed by the analytical quality of the articles, and by the spring, I had joined and regularly attended discussion groups and classes. The Leninist concept of a vanguard party to lead the workers and to govern in their interest was central to the groups that I knew in Berkeley. Vanguardism was, however, antithetical to Deleonism, which held that socialism must be democratic by eliminating the class division endemic to capitalism. Marxist-Leninist economic analysis provides a clear explanation of the experience of America over my adult lifetime. Despite enormous advances in worker productivity, real wages have never gotten back to their levels in 1972. Nearly all of the economic gains of the last half century have gone to the economic elite, particularly the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%. This is because the operations of the market economy over time have produced continuous upward pressure on profits, correlating to continuous downward pressure on wages. Liberals also recognize this as an economic problem that's produced dire social injustice, but they always propose to address it with redistribution schemes. I think that the only solution is for society as a whole assuming democratic ownership of the means of production. Our problem is not distribution, but ownership. So I'm a socialist, an egalitarian, and a small d Democrat, a secularist, an atheist, and a utilitarian. I've always felt that all of these components of my political identity harmonize perfectly. They are all directed to optimizing the results of actions and policies in people's lives. They are based upon consequences and can only be argued on facts. Finally, I'm also a catastrophist, a Cassandra, if you will. Marx taught that the internal contradictions of capital accumulation would produce repeated severe economic crises. But I also thought that a Donald Trump presidency would bring about an existential crisis. And now we additionally have the most virulent global pandemic in a century challenging our economy to its roots. I'm old, of course, but somehow hope always springs eternal. Mr. Toastmaster.